She was 36 years old, 7 months pregnant, standing alone at a podium in federal court with no lawyer, no suit jacket, and no legal degree. The man deciding whether her mother's life work would be demolished by the end of the month sat 12 feet away in a black robe, wearing a pair of Oxford shoes that her mother had resold in 1994 for $8 because he could not afford the full price. He did not remember. She had the receipt. The United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania did not smell like anything Yvette Kaysen had grown up around. It did not smell like leather or resoling cement or the faint mineral bite of saddle soap warming under a work lamp. It smelled like particular stillness of a room where decisions had already been made before anyone walked in. The light overhead was fluorescent and exact, engineered to illuminate without illuminating anything, the way certain powerful rooms were designed to make the people inside them feel smaller than the space. Yvette stood at the plaintiff's podium and set her things down one at a time. A manila folder, edges soft from handling. A yellow legal pad, the top 3 pages filled in the cramped, careful print she used when she was afraid of running out of room. And a book, not a legal brief, not a binder with numbered tabs, but a book with a brown leather cover, its spine cracked in 2 places, its corners worn pale from 3 decades of being opened and closed in a shop that smelled nothing like this room. At the defense table, Preston Albright, lead counsel for Halverson Development Group, 40 years old, a Navy suit that cost more than Yvette's monthly income, sorted through documents with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done this many times and expected to do it many times more. He did not look at Yvette. People like Preston Albright rarely did, at least not in a way that counted as seeing. At the bench, Judge Val Jaldis reviewed something on his desk, his reading glasses low on his nose. He was 54 years old and carried himself the way certain buildings that carry themselves, heavy with authority, indifferent to weather. And on his feet, visible below the bench when he shifted in his chair, were a pair of Oxford shoes, black calfskin, recently polished, the right heel showing the faint, raised edge of a repair so old it had become part of the shoe itself. Yvette noticed them the moment she set down her legal pad. She stood very still for 2 seconds. Then she opened the brown leather book to a page she did not need to search for because she had found it at 2:17 that morning sitting at the kitchen table while Theo slept, and she had not been able to close it since. But before this moment, there was a Tuesday morning in October, and a lock that needed turning, and a woman who was not entirely sure she could keep her hands steady long enough to turn it. Kaysen's shoe repair had stood at 4718 Germantown Avenue in Philadelphia for 33 years. The sign above the door read, Kaysen's Shoe Repair Est, 1991. The paint on the S had been flaking since 2019. Yvette kept meaning to fix it. She had been meaning to fix it for 5 years. On the morning she drove to the courthouse, she stood on the sidewalk after locking up. The October air was cool, still carrying the smell of overnight rain. She put her hand flat against the cold glass of the door. She stood there long enough to feel it travel up through her palm and into her wrist. Then she took her hand away and walked to her car. She did not look back a second time. She knew if she did, she would go back inside and sit in the low wooden chair near the workbench, the one with the seat-worn concave from 30 years of her mother sitting in it, and she would not be able to get back up. Today, she needed to be somewhere else. Halverson Development had offered $147,000 for the building, the business, and everything accumulated inside them. When her husband Theo looked at that number, he saw a down payment on a house in Cheltenham, a yard, a proper room for the baby. When Yvette looked at that number, she saw the brown leather book. She saw the worn seat of the wooden chair. She saw her mother's handwriting and 33 years of careful receipts. She remembered what Rosalie had told her in October of 2017. In the last week, her mother was fully herself. The clear-eyed calm of a woman who had been thinking carefully about what she needed to say while she still could. Rosalie placed the brown leather book in Yvette's hands. She did not say, keep the shop. She did not extract a promise. She said only this, everyone in that book left their name with me. Don't let them become people without an address. Yvette had thought about those words every day for 6 years. She thought about them now, in the parking garage 2 blocks from the courthouse, the brown leather book on the passenger seat beside her. She placed her hand on its cover. Then she opened the car door, pushed herself to her feet in the October cold, and walked. Before we go any further, if this is already sitting somewhere in your chest, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories about ordinary people who carry extraordinary weight, about dignity that does not ask permission, about the choices that never make the news but quietly hold the world together. Now let's go back to that courtroom. Back to Yvette Kaysen at the podium, the brown leather book open in front of her, and a judge who had no idea that his name was written inside it. in the careful handwriting of a woman who believed that everyone who walked through her door was worth remembering. Rosalie Kaysen opened the shop in the spring of 1991 with $300, a second-hand stitching machine, and a landlord who gave her the first 2 months free because he had known her mother and believed that Germantown Avenue needed more people who intended to stay. She was 22 years old. What she had was a father who had worked as a cobbler in Georgia before moving north, who had taught her the difference between a welt and a cement construction before she was tall enough to see over his workbench, and who had died of a heart attack in 1987 when Rosalie was 18. She had his tools. She had his hands. She had the particular patience of someone who had grown up watching a man fix broken things with complete attention, as though the broken thing in front of him were the only broken thing in the world. The shop stayed small. Rosalie never expanded, never franchised, never applied for the kind of loans that might have turned Kaysen's into something with a second location and an employee handbook. She wanted this one. The counter worn smooth by years of customers setting down their shoes. The bell above the door. She wanted to know her customers by name. And she did. Every one of them. Yvette grew up in the shop the way some children grow up in restaurants or barbershops, doing homework on a stool near the counter, learning the rhythm of the place before she could articulate what that rhythm meant. She knew the smell the way she knew her own name. Leather and cement and the faint sweetness of the conditioning oil her mother used on dress shoes before returning them. She was not supposed to be the one who stayed. That was the understanding, not spoken, never spoken, because Rosalie was not a woman who put her ambitions for her daughter into words, knowing that spoken ambitions become pressure. But it was understood in the way certain things are understood between mothers and daughters who know each other well. Yvette was going to leave. Not leave Germantown exactly, but leave the smallness that the shop represented. Not because the shop was small in any way that mattered, but because the world Yvette could reach was large, and Rosalie wanted her to reach it. In 2014, Yvette received a partial scholarship to Temple University's architecture program. She learned load-bearing structures and material tensile strength, and the geometry of spaces designed to make people feel a particular way, and she thought sometimes that her mother had been doing that her whole life, designing a space to make people feel a particular way, without ever using the word architecture to describe it. In October of 2017, Rosalie was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, stage 3. Yvette left Temple in the middle of her 3rd year. She did not think of it as a sacrifice. She thought of it as a decision, which is a different thing. Sacrifices are made for other people. Decisions are made because you know, without being able to fully explain the knowing, that there is only one right thing to do. She came home. She learned the full work, the stitching technique, the lasted construction, the repair of heels and soles. Rosalie taught her from the workbench, then from the wooden chair beside the workbench, then from the chair alone, because by early 2018, the standing had become difficult. Rosalie died in May of 2018. She was 49 years old. Yvette was 27. She kept the shop open the following Monday. The bell above the door rang, and Mr. Beaumont Harris came in with dress shoes needing new lifts, and she took them from him and wrote his name in the brown leather book under the date, the way her mother had written it every time before. The shop stayed open. The book stayed open. The names kept accumulating. That was 9 years ago. Now she was 36, 7 months into a pregnancy that had felt, from the beginning, less like an event and more like a deepening, a sense that the stakes of everything she was already doing had quietly doubled. She and Theo had been married 3 years. He was a good man, careful and steady, the kind who showed up without being asked and fixed things, without announcing he had fixed them. What he understood was numbers. The number Halverson Development was offering was real. The debt on the building was real. The baby coming in 11 weeks was real. The question of whether Yvette was making a practical decision or a sentimental one had been living between them for 6 months without either of them saying it plainly. He was not wrong to worry. He was also not right in the way he thought he was right. That was the part that was hard to hold. Across the city, in a Federal Plaza office facing east toward the Delaware River, Judge Aldous Vance had arrived at his desk at 6:53 that morning, as he arrived every morning, before his clerk, before the stenographer, before anyone whose presence would require him to perform the version of himself that the day demanded. He was 54 years old. He had been a federal judge for 7 years, an assistant U.S. attorney for 11 years before that, a law clerk, a student, a scholarship recipient, a boy from Germantown who had gotten out and built something that could not be taken from him. That was the foundation of his self-understanding, and it had served him well. It was also, if he had been in the habit of examining it closely, the kind of foundation that holds best when no one looks at it too directly. He had grown up 4 blocks from Kaysen's shoe repair. He did not think about that this morning. He read the case file on the Halverson matter, made 2 notes in the margin, and placed the file to the right of his desk, the position it occupied on days when the decision was already clear. Then he put on his robe. He did not think about the shoes. He never thought about the shoes. The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock. At 8:57, Preston Albright finished arranging his documents, uncapped a pen, and set it parallel to the edge of the table with the precision of a man who believed that small acts of order projected large acts of control. He had tried 11 eminent domain cases in the Eastern District. He had won 9 of them. The 2 he had lost had been decided on technicalities, which in his view meant he had never actually lost. He glanced once at Yvette's side of the room, at the manila folder, the legal pad, the brown leather book, and looked away with the expression of someone who has assessed a situation and found it manageable. At 9 o'clock exactly, Judge Vance entered. Everyone rose. He surveyed the room over his reading glasses and said, "Be seated. This is the matter of Halverson Development Group versus the City of Philadelphia and affected property owners, parcels of block 4728 through 4724 Germantown Avenue. We are here on the consolidated petition for condemnation under eminent domain. Mr. Albright, you may proceed." Preston Albright stood. He was very good at this, not good the way it is good when they love what they do, but good the way a machine is good. Efficient, calibrated, producing exactly the output it was designed to produce. He walked the court through the Halverson proposal with the confidence of someone who has rehearsed a story so many times it no longer feels like a story. He spoke about economic development. He spoke about job creation, 412 permanent positions, citing a figure from a consultant's report that Halverson had commissioned and Halverson had paid for. He spoke about blighted properties and underutilized commercial space. He held up photographs of Germantown Avenue, selected photographs, Yvette noticed, chosen for maximum deterioration, angled to avoid the laundromat with the new awning, the family-owned hardware store, the church whose congregation had been meeting on that block for 61 years. He spoke for 22 minutes. He never looked at Yvette. When he sat down, Judge Vance said in a tone that carried no warmth, "Mrs. Kaysen, you have chosen to represent yourself in this matter. You may proceed." Yvette stood. The gallery held maybe 40 people, a few reporters, several property owners from the block, neighbors who had come without being asked because word had moved through Germantown the way word moves through a neighborhood that has been paying attention for a long time. Mr. Beaumont Harris was there in the 3rd row, in a gray sport coat she had not seen him wear before. He had polished his shoes. She noticed that. She had prepared an opening. She had written it out 3 times and crossed it out twice. Standing at the podium now, she looked at what she had written and understood that the prepared words were not the right words. She set the legal pad to the side. "Your Honor," she said, "Kaysen's shoe repair has been at Fortintown Avenue since 1991. My mother opened it when she was 22 years old. I have run it since 2018. Last month we repaired shoes for 114 customers. I have the records." She touched the brown leather book. "I am not here to argue that the shop is more important than the law. I am here because I believe the law, read carefully, is on our side, and I am going to show the court why." She walked through the city's public use justification point by point, in the flat, careful language she had spent 2 weeks learning. She cited Kello v. City of New London, the 2005 Supreme Court decision that had expanded the government's ability to seize private property for economic development, and had in doing so created a precedent used to displace Black and low-income communities in city after city because those were the communities with the least political power to resist. Here the narrator pauses, because what Yvette was describing was not an abstraction. It was a pattern with a name and a history. Eminent domain is the legal power that allows governments to take private property for public use, provided the owner receives fair compensation. On paper, it is a tool for building roads, schools, and hospitals, things that serve everyone. In practice, beginning in the 1950s and running hard through the 1970s, it became something else. Under the banner of what politicians called urban renewal, more than 1,500 Black neighborhoods across the United States were demolished. Not destroyed by poverty or neglect, demolished deliberately by government action with court approval. Homes, churches, barbershops, repair shops, businesses that had taken generations to build, cleared to make way for highways, stadiums, and development projects described as progress, but which served, in nearly every case, populations that did not include the people being removed. The residents had their own name for it. They called it Negro removal. Philadelphia was not exempt. The construction of I-95 alone, in the 1950s and 60s, destroyed multiple established Black communities along the waterfront. The people displaced were told they would be compensated, relocated, remembered. Most were not. What Yvette Kaysen was standing in front of that morning was not new. It was the same machinery, wearing a newer suit. She had been speaking for 11 minutes when Vance set down his pen. Mrs. Kaysen. His voice was measured. The court has reviewed your written submission. I recognize that the history you are describing carries weight. He paused in the way judges pause when they have decided what they are going to say and are giving the room time to prepare for it. But legal argument requires more than historical context. Sentimentality is not a legal standard. What this court needs is a specific statutory basis for your objection, not a story, a legal argument. The word landed in the room, sentimentality, not malicious, not even intentional in the way cruelty is intentional. It was the word of a man who had spent so long in rooms where feelings were classified as obstacles to precision that he had stopped distinguishing between grief that was self-indulgent and grief that was the only rational response to what was actually happening. Yvette did not react immediately. She stood at the podium. She looked at Judge Vance, and then for the first time since she had walked into this room, she looked at his shoes, not only at the repair, which she had already cataloged, but at the shoes themselves, the way they had been cared for. The particular quality of leather that has been polished consistently over years by someone who understands that maintenance is a form of respect. Her mother had understood that. She placed her hand on the brown leather book. Your Honor, she said. Her voice had not changed. I have a statutory argument. But first, with the court's permission, I have something that belongs in the record. Judge Vance looked at her over his reading glasses. Proceed, he said. Yvette opened the brown leather book. She did not open it to the page she had marked. She opened it to the beginning, to the first entry, dated March 14, 1991, written in her mother's careful hand on the ruled line at the top of the first page. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but the letters were still exact. Rosalie had written with the deliberateness of someone who had learned that handwriting was a form of respect paid to the thing being recorded. This is my mother's customer ledger, Yvette said. Kaysen's shoe repair. March 1991 through May 2024. 33 years of continuous operation at 4718 Germantown Avenue. Every repair, every customer, every date. In my mother's handwriting for the first 27 years, and in mine for the last 6. She set the book flat on the podium and turned it so the court reporter could see the spine. Halverson Development Group has described the properties on this block as underutilized commercial space. I want to show the court what utilization looks like from the inside of one of those properties. She began to read, not all of it, not even most of it, but enough. She read the name Estelle Moorhead, 83 years old, who had brought the same pair of black church shoes to Kaysen's every spring for 28 years to have them resoled before Easter Sunday. Estelle had died in 2019. Her daughter Cheryl still brought the shoes. The same pair, maintained now across 2 generations, every spring. Cheryl Moorhead was in the gallery. She did not stand. She pressed her hands together in her lap and looked straight ahead. She read the name of Deshaun Alcott, who had been 17 when his mother first brought him to the shop to have his interview shoes polished for a job application at the post office. He had gotten the job. He had come back to have those same shoes polished before every significant moment in his life for the next 19 years. Before his wedding, before his promotion, before his son's christening, before his mother's funeral. Deshaun was 46 now and worked as a supervisor at the distribution center on Wissahickon. He was not in the gallery, but his mother, Harriet Alcott, 71, was. She stood up when Yvette read his name. Slowly, with the careful dignity of a woman who has decided that this is a moment that requires her to be on her feet, and she stayed standing. She read the name of Pastor Wendell Osee of Greater Refuge Baptist Church, 2 blocks north, who had brought the choir's dress shoes to Kaysen's for resoling every year since 1997. 27 years, 114 pairs of shoes. Rosalie had charged him a reduced rate because she believed that a choir that sang well was a form of public service, and she had written this in the margin beside his name in 1997 in her small, deliberate hand, reduced, community music. Pastor Osee was in the 4th row. He stood when Yvette read his name. Preston Albright wrote something on his legal pad. She read the name of Marcus Webb, who ran the hardware store at 4722, 2 doors down from Kaysen's. He was already standing when she found his name. She read the name of a woman named Gloria Tran, who had moved to Germantown from Saigon in 1994 with her husband and 2 children, and had not spoken much English and had brought a pair of her husband's work boots to the shop that first winter because they were the only boots he owned, and the soles were separating, and she had not known where else to go. Rosalie had fixed the boots and refused payment and written in the margin, "No charge, new to the block, make her feel welcome." Gloria Tran's daughter, Linda, 34 years old, a nurse at Jefferson Hospital, had gotten word of the hearing through a neighborhood group and was sitting in the second row. She had not planned to stand. But when Yvette read her mother's name, she stood up before she had decided to. The way the body sometimes responds to something before the mind is finished thinking about it. The gallery was quiet in a way that was different from the silence at the beginning of the hearing. At the beginning, the silence had been procedural, the silence of people waiting for something to happen. This silence was something else. It was the silence of people recognizing something. Yvette turned one more page. On April 9, 1994, she said, "My mother received a pair of Oxford shoes. Black calfskin. The sole of the right heel was worn through. She replaced the heel, reconditioned the leather, and charged $8. A student rate, because the young man who brought them in told her he was in his first year of law school at Penn and could not afford the standard repair. She did not look at Vance. She did not need to. My mother noted the customer's name in this ledger the same way she noted every name. She wrote, A. Vance, Oxford, right heel, student 8. And below that, in the column she used for personal notes, the same column where she wrote reduced community music and no charge, new to the block, she wrote 4 words. Yvette looked down at the page. She read them aloud. Good hands, will go far. The room did not make a sound. Yvette reached into the manila folder and removed a single sheet of paper. A photocopy of the original receipt, the carbon still legible after 30 years, Rosalie's signature at the bottom in the looping cursive she used for receipts, and nowhere else. She set it on the edge of the podium where the court reporter could see it. Your Honor, she said, your name has been in this book since 1994. You left it there yourself, at a counter on Germantown Avenue, in the hands of a woman who wrote good hands beside it and meant it as a prediction, not a compliment. She closed the book. The property Halverson Development Group wants to demolish is not underutilized space. It is the address where this community has left its name for 33 years, where Estelle Moorhead's Easter shoes are still being maintained by her daughter, where Deshaun Alcott prepared for every important day of his life, where a woman new to this country was made to feel welcome on a winter afternoon with nothing more than a repaired boot and a refusal to take her money. She put both hands flat on the podium. That is not sentimentality, Your Honor. That is evidence. And I have 33 years of it in my mother's handwriting and mine right here. The courtroom held its breath. In the third row, Mr. Beaumont Harris, 71 years old, red coat, freshly polished shoes, stood up quietly, without drama the way a man stands up when he has decided that sitting down is no longer the right thing to do. He did not say anything. He just stood. Judge Vance did not move for a long time. Not the practiced stillness of a man who has learned to perform composure on a bench. This was something different. This was the stillness of someone who has been handed a weight they were not expecting and has not yet decided where to set it down. Preston Albright looked up from his legal pad. He studied Vance. He looked at Yvette. He looked back at Vance. He'd been in enough courtrooms to know the temperature of a room had changed in a way that did not favor him. Your Honor, he said carefully, the plaintiff's submission, while affecting, does not constitute a cognizable legal argument under the applicable standard. The personal history of a single business, however long-standing, cannot override a lawfully executed. Mr. Albright. Vance's voice was quiet, not sharp, just quiet in a way that ended the sentence. I heard you the first time. He took off his reading glasses. He set them on the desk with a small, precise click. From where he sat, he could not read the handwriting on the photocopy. He did not need to. The shape of it was enough, the looping cursive at the bottom. The carbon paper, pale with age, holding its record the way documents hold records, not because they were meant to be preserved, but because no one ever had reason to throw them away. The court will take a 30-minute recess, he said. He stood. Everyone rose. He walked through the side door, and it closed behind him. In 31 years on the law, Aldous Vance had never called a recess in the middle of a hearing for a reason he could not have explained to his clerk without embarrassment. He sat at the desk in his chamber, still in his robe, and looked at his shoes. The right heel, the faint raised seam where the replacement leather met the original sole, invisible unless you were looking, and even then, only if you knew what a proper repair looked like. He had not thought about this repair in years. He had not thought about the shop. He had not thought about Germantown Avenue in the way that required him to place himself back on it as the person he had been rather than the person he had become. He thought about it now. He had been 23 years old, first year at Penn Law on a scholarship that covered tuition and nothing else. The shoes had been a gift from his father, the nicest thing my father had ever given him, purchased secondhand and presented in a shoebox with the tissue paper still inside because his father had understood that a man going to Penn Law needed shoes that said something. The right heel had given out 2 months in. He had taken the train back to Germantown on a Saturday because he knew there was a shop on the avenue that did not charge what the campus cobbler charged. He remembered the bell above the door. He remembered the smell, leather and cement, and something sweet underneath. He remembered setting the shoes on the counter and the woman who picked them up and turned them in her hands, with the attention of someone assessing not just the damage but the history of the object. She had looked at the heel. She had looked at him. She had asked if he was a student. He said, Penn Law. She said yes. She said, how is it? He said, hard. She said, good. Hard means you belong there. She wrote his name in the book and told him to come back Thursday. He had come back Thursday, $8. He had tried to give her a 10. She had shaken her head and made change and said, you'll have other things to spend the rest on. He had not thought about that afternoon in 30 years. Or he had thought about it the way you think about the early chapters of a story you have mostly stopped telling, present somewhere in the archive, not retrieved, not understood as continuous with who you had since become. The woman who had made change for $8 and told him hard means you belong there had a daughter who was now standing in his courtroom, 7 months pregnant, no lawyer. A brown leather book and a photocopy found at 2 a.m, trying to save the place her mother had built. And he had told her that what she was doing was sentimentality. He sat with that word, turned it over the way her mother had turned over those shoes, not to judge it, but to understand what it had been asked to carry and whether it had been equal to the task. He had spent 30 years building a self-understanding on the proposition that leaving Germantown was not abandonment, but ascent, that you honored where you came from by going somewhere better. He had believed this so thoroughly and for so long that he had stopped examining whether it was true or simply convenient. A woman who had given up an architecture scholarship to come home and sit in her mother's chair had just shown him, with 33 years of names in careful handwriting, what it looked like to honor where you were from by staying. He did not know whether he had made the wrong choice. That was not the question. The question was whether the efficiency of leaving had come at a price he had never added to the ledger. He put his glasses back on. He stood. When he walked back through the side door and everyone rose, he took his seat and looked at Yvette Kaysen, still standing, both hands flat on the podium, the brown leather book closed in front of her, and he said, Ms. Kaysen, I owe you a correction. The word I used earlier was imprecise. What you have presented is not sentimentality. I should not have called it that. He paused. You said you also have a statutory argument. The court is ready to hear it. Yvette looked at him across the 12 feet between the podium and the bench. I'm not asking you to remember kindness, Your Honor, she said. I'm asking you to remember who you were before you decided that leaving was the same as arriving. Then she picked up her legal pad, and she made her argument. The statutory argument took 40 minutes. Yvette had found it on a Tuesday night 3 weeks earlier, at 11:45, sitting at the kitchen table with 4 browser tabs open and a yellow legal pad full of crossed-out lines. She had been looking for a real legal reason, not a moral one, because moral reasons were not what the court was going to act on, and she had almost missed it because it was not in any of the eminent domain cases she had been reading. It was in the procedural record of the city's own petition. Halverson Development Group had submitted its public benefit analysis to the city in February of the previous year. The city had approved the petition in April. Under Pennsylvania's eminent domain code, Section 303, a municipality considering condemnation for economic development was required to hold at least one public consultation meeting with affected property owners before issuing a finding of public necessity. The city had not held that meeting. There was no record of it having been scheduled. There was no record of it having been waived. There was simply a gap, 8 weeks of process during which the requirement had not been fulfilled, and no one apparently had noticed. Yvette had noticed. She walked the court through it point by point, her voice careful and even, stopping twice when Vance asked questions. Real questions, the kind that meant he was following rather than waiting for the argument to end. Albright objected twice. Vance overruled him both times without ceremony. When she finished, the courtroom was quiet. Vance looked at the city's counsel, a man named Gerald Holt, mid-50s, who had the expression of someone who had just realized the file he had been handed was missing something important. Vance asked directly whether the consultation requirement had been satisfied. Holt asked for 3 minutes to confer. Vance gave them. At the end of 3 minutes, Holt stood and said, carefully, that the city was unable to confirm at this time that the Section 303 requirement had been satisfied in the manner specified by the code. Vance looked at him. That is a careful way of saying no, he said. He looked at his notes. He looked at the photocopy of the receipt still sitting at the edge of the court reporter's station. Then he looked up. The court finds that the city's petition for condemnation of parcels 4C18 through 4C24, Germantown Avenue, fails to satisfy the procedural requirements of Pennsylvania Eminent Domain Code Section 303. The record contains no documentation of a public consultation meeting with affected property owners prior to the city's finding of public necessity. This omission is not a technical deficiency. It is a substantive failure that goes to the validity of the condemnation proceeding itself. The petition is denied. He set down his pen. Mr. Albright, Halverson Development Group is not precluded from refiling a properly noticed petition. The court is not ruling on the merits of the development proposal. It is ruling on the process. Process exists for a reason. He looked at Yvette. Miss Kaysen. She met his eyes. He held her gaze for 2 seconds, the particular attention of a man who has been reminded of something he set down a long time ago and is not yet sure what to do with it now that he has picked it up again. Then he gathered his papers and stood, and the room rose with him, and he walked through the side door. In the gallery, Mr. Beaumont Harris sat back down slowly, adjusting his sport coat at the shoulder. Marcus Webb from the hardware store caught Yvette's eye across the room and nodded once, the nod of one business owner to another, acknowledgement without decoration. Pastor Ossie said something quiet to the woman beside him. Harriet Alcott, who had stood when Yvette read her son's name and had not sat back down until now, smoothed the front of her blouse and gathered her purse with the careful movements of a woman who has witnessed something worth witnessing and intends to carry it home properly. Yvette stood at the podium until the room had mostly emptied. Then she picked up the brown leather book, the manila folder, the yellow legal pad. She stacked them in the order she had carried them in and walked out into the corridor. At the end of the hall, a window looked out over Market Street 14 floors below. She stood there for a moment and watched the city move, buses and pedestrians and the thin October light crossing the glass of the buildings across the street. She was not thinking about anything in particular. The effort had simply completed itself, the way a long effort does. Not because you have decided to stop, but because the thing has run its full distance. She put her hand on the glass, cold. The same cold as the shop door that morning. She took out her phone and called Theo. He did not pick up. She listened to his voicemail, his voice unhurried, and said, "We won. Come home when you're done, I'll make dinner." She hung up. She took her hand off the glass, and she walked toward the elevator in the street and the drive back to Germantown Avenue, where a sign above a door was waiting for her to come home and fix a letter that had been flaking for 5 years. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she would fix it. She got back to the shop at 4:30. The afternoon light was low and amber, the kind that comes in October when the sun is already thinking about leaving and throws everything it has left at the last hour. It came through the front window of Kaysen's shoe repair at a long diagonal and landed on the counter in a stripe that moved almost imperceptibly as the earth turned. Yvette had watched that stripe her whole childhood. She knew exactly where it would be at 4:30 in October. She had never thought of this as knowledge. It was just something she knew. She unlocked the door. The bell rang. She stood in the doorway for a moment without going in, the way you stand in a doorway when you have been away from a place and are letting yourself arrive before you step all the way through. The shop smelled the way it always smelled, leather and cement, and the faint sweetness of the conditioning oil, layered over decades into something that was not quite any one of those things but all of them together. A smell so specific to this room that she had never encountered it anywhere else and never expected to. She went in. She set the brown leather book on the counter. She set the manila folder and the yellow legal pad beside it. Then she walked to the back of the shop, to the low wooden chair beside the workbench, and she sat down in it. She had not sat in it since the week after her mother died 6 years ago, when she had come in on a Saturday morning and sat here 20 minutes before she felt able to stand up and begin. She had not sat in it since then because sitting in it meant something she was not always ready for it to mean. The seat was worn concave, shaped over 30 years to the particular weight and posture of a woman who sat with her elbows on her knees and her head slightly forward when she was working, who leaned back only when she was thinking, who rarely fully rested because there was always something to be done, and she had always preferred doing it. Yvette sat in it now and felt the shape of it. She placed one hand on her stomach, the way she had been doing without thinking for 7 months, the way you do when there is someone there who cannot yet hear anything but the sounds of the place you are in, and you want those sounds to be the right ones. The shop was quiet. Outside, Germantown Avenue did what it always did at 4:30. The school bus going north. A woman with a stroller, two men talking on the corner in the unhurried way of men who have known each other a long time and are not in a hurry to finish. The ordinary sounds of a block that was still standing. Yvette listened to them without moving. On the wall behind the workbench, her mother had hung three things: a small framed photograph of her own father standing in front of a workbench in Georgia that Yvette had never seen in person, a calendar from 2018, still turned to May, which Yvette had never taken down because taking it down had always felt like more than taking down a calendar, and a strip of paper taped directly to the wall in Rosalie's handwriting, the ink faded now to near invisibility, that read, "Fix the thing in front of you. The rest will follow." Yvette looked at that strip of paper for a long time. Through the front window, the light was fading. The amber stripe on the counter had moved to the edge and was nearly gone. In a few minutes, it would be dark, and she would turn on the work lamp, and the shop would look the way it looked every evening, small and lit, and full of the quiet industry of a place that had things to do and intended to do them. But for now, she sat in her mother's chair, in the last of the October, with her hand on her stomach and the smell of 33 years around her, and she let herself be exactly where she was. The sign above the door still needed fixing. The S was still flaking. Tomorrow, she had told herself, she still meant it. Tomorrow, she would climb the small ladder and sand the paint and repaint the letter so precisely that you would not be able to tell it had ever been anything other than whole. Tomorrow, the work would continue the way it always continued. But tonight, she sat still, and the shop held her. And somewhere in the walls and the floor and the worn seat of the chair and the smell of the leather and the strip of paper with the faded ink, her mother was present in the way that the people who build things for us are always present, not as ghosts, not as memory exactly, but as structure, as the reason the walls are where they are, as the reason the door still opens. Yvette closed her eyes. She listened to the block outside. She let her daughter hear it too. Yvette Kaysen is a fictional character, but the machinery she walked into that courtroom to fight is real. Eminent domain has been used throughout American history to take land from communities that built it, in the name of progress that rarely reached them. The Section 303 consultation requirement that Yvette found is based on real provisions in Pennsylvania law, provisions that exist precisely because lawmakers recognize that the people most affected by condemnation decisions are often the least heard in the rooms where those decisions are made. Every year, families and small business owners across the country stand in hearings like this one, without lawyers, without resources, with nothing but the evidence of what they have built and the argument that it deserves to remain. Some of them win. Many do not. Rosalie Kaysen is also fictional, but the woman who opens a shop at 22 with $300 and a second-hand machine and keeps a ledger with every customer's name for 33 years, that woman exists. She has existed on every block in every city that has ever been told its people are underutilized. This story is for her. And for the daughters who come back. What did someone in your family build with their hands, with their stubbornness, with their refusal to, that you are still standing inside of today? If that question sits somewhere in your chest right now, hold on to it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because that is the kind of question we come back to here every single week, in story after story, about people who carried more than they were given credit for and built more than anyone expected. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one of these stories. Like this video if Yvette's walk into that courtroom meant something to you, if the brown leather book meant something, if the $8 meant something, if the words "good hands" will go far landed somewhere real. Share it with someone in your life who is in the middle of a fight they are not sure they can win. Not because this story promises they will win. Life does not make that promise, but because there is something in watching a person walk into the room with the evidence of what they have built and refuse to call it small. That is worth seeing. That is worth passing on. Tell us in the comments, what did someone in your family build that you are still standing inside of? The shop, the house, the church pew, the recipe, the habit of showing up, whatever it is, we want to hear it. These stories do not end when the video does. They continue in the comments and the things people say to each other when they recognize that they are not alone in what they are carrying. One more thing, Yvette's victory in that courtroom was not the end of the story. Halverson Development Group can refile. The city can correct its process. The machinery does not stop because it loses one round. What actually changes, is whether the people in the path of it know their rights, know their records, know that 33 years of names and careful handwriting is not sentimentality, it is evidence. Keep your record. And if you are standing in a room where someone is telling you that what you have built does not count, remember that the people who say that are counting on you to believe them. Yvette Kaysen did not believe them, neither should you. Subscribe. We will see you in the next one.